بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه بجهدهم قام هذا الدين رضي الله عنهم أجمعين ثم أما بعد. In this reflection, we're going to think about the methodology of Imam Ibn Khaldun rahmatullahi alayh as regards education or instruction, more specifically, in various sciences. Imam Ibn Khaldun rahmatullahi alayh, in the Muqaddimah we find, is concerned with ensuring that the student of knowledge is not focusing solely on memorizing knowledge, rote memory. He's not against memorization, but what he makes a case against is building an approach to education which does not cultivate in the student understanding. In other words, he wants the student to have developed through the process of instruction and education comprehension of that material which is being digested or studied. He suggests that we approach knowledge not only gradually, but that we do so more specifically in a layered manner. Now, what that entails is that the student of knowledge develop about a science that's being studied, or even a section of a text, a skeleton, a framework, which will tell us what's going on in that section, what's going on in that text. When we look at reading instruction, contemporary Western educational discourses, it's very important we see, in order for literacy to be developed, for the student to understand the way a text is structured, the framework of the text, for the student to be familiar on how to navigate through the text, right? Part of navigating through a text is understanding what each section of the text is trying to accomplish before studying that text with depth. Many Western texts, or textbooks, I should say, or even you find texts which are not necessarily textbooks used in universities, but they're well written, they're researched quite well. The structure of the text is such that you can understand prior to reading a section what will take place in that section that you're about to read. Usually you find that information at the beginning of the text. So the role of the teacher then is to guide the student with the framework in such a manner that the student will understand how to classify the main themes that will be encountered while undertaking a particular study. Now, to put it differently, to have a skeleton or a framework which will make clear to the student what a particular section or science is all about. Section of a text here I'm talking about. Trying to go in between how do we study a science overall and how will we study a text by itself, right? A text overall, and that text may deal with particular topics, or science overall, and that text may be introduction to that science that we may be studying. So we study a text overall, we also want to break down that text into sections. And so we want to say that even when we study a section of a text, we should have a working knowledge of the framework of that section. What is being attacked in that section? What is being presented in that section? What's the goal of that section? And we would say the same for a whole text overall. What is the goal of this text? What is being attacked? What's being worked on? That's what I mean by what's being attacked. What is it desired to be achieved after reading or studying that particular text. And in more specificity, when we study a science, we need to know what that science is about. And each section of a text which is communicating to us a science, we need to understand how that section will eventually relate to another section. So these are the type of meta questions or questions that should be running around in our heads. Like, how can we develop overall structure which will allow us to see where we're going? Now, in the beginning stages of knowledge, that may be unproductive to get a big picture, so to speak. You can do that if the book that you're studying is well written and an introduction to each section is presented in brief prior to even going into the meat of the text, so to speak. Now, if you're studying a text which is not structured that way, many of the texts that are written in the past in Islamic sciences don't have the same accommodations that we find in contemporary texts, such as very well structured indexes, table of contents, and so on and so forth. Maybe even micro uh, chapter headings which will allow us to even see when it is that a theme will shift, because one chapter maybe that is composed of 50 pages. At the top of each chapter it will say what it's about. So then after 50 pages we'll see that the chapter switches in its content. So that we're always kept in focus just by looking at the top of the page. We know, oh well, this is what this is about. This is what this is about as far as what we're reading is concerned. It may be pertaining to a particular issue which we may forget, and all we have to do, an overall concept that we may forget because we get lost in details, and then all we have to do is look at the top of the page and we're reminded about the key idea once again, or the overall aim of that chapter. So contemporary accommodations, the way that texts are structured make it a lot easier for the student to classify and categorize and so on and so forth the subject matter which is being studied, because in reality is done for you. There's not a lot of work that needs to be done. But in texts that are written in the past, we do a lot of that work in our own minds. While we're reading, while we are reading, we classify and we categorize and we relate and we connect and we criticize and we understand and we specify and we call into question and so on and so forth. We have a series of different processes that are at work and taking place within our minds while we're reading the text, whereas a contemporary text usually does a lot of that work for you. And sometimes what happens even in that process is that we become mentally lazy, and we overlook a lot of things because of the simplification that's taking place in the presentation of a text. In other words, the whole structure of the text simplifies the contents of the text. And because of that, we may lose the capacity to be sensitive to the depth that an idea may carry in a text. The conversation is quite long in that regard. But overall, what Imam Ibn Khaldun rahmatullahi alayhi is presenting to us is the whole idea of approaching a text gradually. So even each step in the beginning stages of approaching a text, say for instance, if we say that this is an introduction, that introduction will be composed of a number of steps that we have to follow in order to be able to of the introduction. So what happens is that once we go through a series of steps and those steps compose a level of knowledge, we should be able to move on to another level, which will follow that initial stage of learning. But what Imam Ibn Khaldun suggests is that we attack that particular level of knowledge in a gradual way, step by step, but also overall that we approach it in a gradual way. So what that would entail is reading a text very lightly, not going into too much depth. But what you're doing in that first reading is trying to develop a framework of what's going on. Then once you digest that framework, a second reading takes place by which you attack the text, you approach the text with more depth of concentration and focus and research. And another reading will give you a more complete understanding. So that each step that's taking place in study is interconnected, but also opening the student up to proceed to another level of understanding. So what we're doing is establishing a foundation and then building our structure upon that foundation, our structure of comprehension and understanding. So Imam Ibn Khaldun suggests then that we focus on mastery and comprehension when we study. And he was not a big proponent of rote memorization, at least in the section that we're considering here, which is how to approach instruction in various sciences and how to benefit from those sciences. I won't say that Imam Ibn Khaldun was against memorization, but what he did see was that in other educational philosophies that were prevalent in the Muslim world where memorization was taking place, that this killed the whole learning process. But he's not talking about memorization in and of itself. He's talking about rote memorization without comprehension. We know that memorization allows a person to be able to master knowledge in a way which is very distinctive. When you can recall a body of knowledge from your long-term memory into your short-term memory and analyze that content which is being studied for that moment within your mind, it's a lot easier uh, to benefit from that knowledge versus having to recall that knowledge in a book, because there's always a gap between where your memory is at and the text is at. There's more room for developing aptitude, and in this case, the term aptitude means meleka or know-how or mastery over a text when at least the main ideas uh, are memorized. The memory is the soldier of understanding, so to speak. It supports and aids understanding, and this is something that we in the West, in particular in the U.S., are not accustomed to doing anymore. Our society is a society which is fast-paced, so the psychology that we bring to education is one in which we're concerned with comprehension to some extent, but not always mastery, and definitely not memorization. Except when we go into certain fields of knowledge like chemistry and medicine and so on and so forth. The hard sciences a lot of times require memorizing the intense memorization of facts. But overall, what we see is that our approach to testing even kind of moves us away from memorization, and it has created a deficiency in our approach to knowledge. But Imam Ibn Khaldun, in his approach of emphasizing comprehension, is more close to where we're at in philosophy of education in the West, and in particular in the US. But what brings a position of strength, of reinforcement to the whole uh, idea or call for ensuring that comprehension is what we're aiming at in education, is that if we can memorize at least the overall framework or main themes of a particular body of knowledge that we're studying, then that would help us to develop even faster our ability to master a subject. Now, all subjects may not be uh, material to uh, be memorized, but at least when we talk about memorization, we should consider, the text of Islam, which are considered to be primary, such as Quran and Hadith, uh, and even maybe some text in the Arabic language as far as grammatic principles are concerned. But when it comes to the Arabic language, there is a philosophy out there that is of the mind that constant exposure to those principles automatically brings on memorization just by familiarity and by consistency and constancy in interacting with that knowledge. But the Quran also, uh, some say that that is the reality of even the Quran, that if we read on a constant basis, that it automatically sinks into us and we begin to memorize unknowingly or knowingly. But regardless of that approach or position, the memorization of the Quran is something which all Muslims should be uh, concerned with. And the memorization of a hadith, this is what supports our understanding, and this is what supports our mastery of other sciences, especially the Arabic language. Because by memorization of the Quran and memorization of hadith, we learn the forms of that which is the best form of Arabic, or the best delivery of Arabic, or the best communication of Arabic. So the Quran and the hadith uh, support and give us a strong foundation for the study of the Arabic language, because we begin to have embedded in us those practices of the Arabic language, the way it's communicated, the way it is used, its usage is there in our memories uh, when we memorize, because the way that Allah may address a particular situation, in one case, may not be the way that Allah addresses a situation in another context. So then you begin to have different forms of address memorized already within your mind and heart just by memorizing chapters of the Quran. So, with the study of the Arabic language as a science in and of itself, by the time we go from grammar and morphology to study rhetoric, then we have with us a set of principles, grammatical principles, and morphological principles that will complement the study of rhetoric, and those things which would allow us to be able to now comprehend that which we memorized. So memorizing the Quran, it gives us aptitude. It helps us develop aptitude in the Arabic language once we're moving toward comprehending the way that the language works. So Imam Ibn Khaldun wasn't against memorizing, but what he wanted to achieve in an educational system was to develop a mind which is sharp and focused on comprehending, focused on mastery. But that mastery is not to be equated with memorization. Rote memorization doesn't allow us to comprehend with depth uh, a particular topic. What it does is supports that process, but memorization is not that end, or that is not that goal, which is comprehension. So Imam Ibn Khaldun tells us to approach the study of Islamic sciences in layers or in steps, And what we should be content with doing in the beginning stages is just becoming familiar. It's like taking a walk in a home that you would like to purchase. And in the first instant of going into that home that you want to purchase, you're just becoming familiar with the home and seeing if you want to invest. But in the case of knowledge, what we're doing is taking a look around the structure that we're studying, and what we're trying to do is become familiar with what's going on so that we can invest. So there's buy-in from the beginning. If we have buy-in from the beginning, if we're committed to study, that means then that we familiarize ourselves with knowledge in a gradual manner, in a step-by-step systematic manner, with levels in mind. So if we study a text, we just want to become familiar with that text in a very brief manner at first, and then what we want to do the second time around of studying it is bring in depth to that, and more depth. And then after a certain period of time, we connect that which we studied and mastered, that content, with another body of knowledge, or another set uh, of content, and then we're able to see what is the relationship between these two bodies of knowledge, between these contents that's there before us that we studied in a systematic way and compartmentalized way. Now we have to find the relationship between those different spheres that we exposed ourselves to and we tried to master systematically. And then when we begin to see the relationship between various spheres of knowledge, we begin to have a whole system in place, and we see how that whole system interacts. So we have different sciences, and then we begin to understand how those different sciences interact and how those sciences overall allow us to understand the Quran and the Sunnah. So we use those as tools, entry points into understanding the text that are the foundational source of our uh, belief and practice, which are the Quran and the Sunnah in this case. So the goal of all Islamic sciences is to come to some understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah for the sake of practice and coming close to Allah in heart and in action and in intellect and in emotion. So overall, then Imam Ibn Khaldun presents to us in simple a profound methodology for mastery of Islamic sciences and for charting our path in an ocean without borders or boundaries. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.